Good evening, everybody. It's Dr. Malika. It is October the 3rd, 2017, and this is Transformation Tuesday. And today I wanted to approach a topic that I feel like is relevant, something that needs to be discussed, and also something that I feel like I've been getting messages and questions about just because of the things that are happening currently in our society, specifically the incident that happened in Las Vegas, Nevada over this past weekend at the concert where 59 people, I believe is the count, were killed and hundreds others were wounded at a concert on the Las Vegas Strip. And I wanted to look at this particular topic of violence in our community. How does it impact us? How does it affect us, not just simply from seeing these things from a distance, but does it affect us mentally and emotionally? And how does it impact us as a whole, as a society? A lot of times when we look at violence and traumas on this scale in our society, we look at things on a larger scale. So we can reflect back to 9/11 and how that impacted our country as a whole, and how people are still impacted emotionally by 9/11, even if they didn't directly have a person that was a loved one or a friend that passed away due to what occurred on 9/11. The entire country and probably other parts of the world were impacted emotionally and mentally by what happened on those days. And we consider that to be a mass trauma because it's something that happened on a large scale and it impacted people on a large scale. But when we look at gun violence, and the reality is gun violence is something that's happening across our country. It's not always these big major events that happen that are part of the gun violence in some areas. In some cities, it's on a smaller scale, but it's happening constantly. And so it's something that we have to address, and we can't act as if just because we're not a direct victim of gun violence and we're not directly impacted by gun violence, that this doesn't hurt or harm us in some kind of way emotionally. And so I wanted to just look at some numbers when it comes to gun violence. And these numbers for me were very telling. It looked at the fact that in the United States, that gun violence is something that's very visible, that more than 11,000 Americans are killed in an assault involving a gun annually, and at least 50,000 more are injured. It also says that among ages 15 to 24, 9 of every 100,000 lives ends due to a gun homicide. And anyone above the age of 65, ages about every 65 of every 100,000 in that age group is also injured by gun assaults every year. So it shows you that this is at a number that is much higher than people would consider it to be. And in the mid 80s, it was considered by the public health department to be considered an epidemic just for the large numbers of proportions of how it was happening in relationship to the population. And so I'm sure we can look at the numbers if we were to pull the numbers currently in comparison to how they were looking at it as epidemic levels in the 1980s. We could see that it probably is still, if not higher than that, in our current time with our current population. So we can say definitively that this is a problem. Even if we didn't have these statistics to back it up, a lot of people would still say this is a problem because we should not have situations that are happening like that where people are basically using their right to bear arms as an excuse to go out and harm and assault other people. So a lot of the questions I got is, first of all, how does this impact us? And the reality is that there are a lot of different ways that seeing these things impact us. There's no way for us to see this violence on a constant basis, to see the news, to hear about these stories, to hear about the lives lost and not be impacted in a dramatic way. It's one thing to hear about this under the guise of being at war, or it happening to soldiers who are signing up to possibly give their lives in order to protect the freedoms of the country that they serve. That's a little bit more understandable for us to process and digest, although that even too is hard for us to process. But it's a little bit different when we're talking about violence in our everyday lives, in our everyday communities, at everyday events like concerts. And that is the thing that's the most impacting. It can impact people to the point where they're walking around on heightened alert and they're fearful of what could possibly happen. And that is a legitimate feeling. If we're seeing these incidents happening at higher numbers and higher occurrences, of course, this is going to impact us in a way to where now we're hyper vigilant and we're worried about our safety because we know that in this country, one of our rights is the ability to bear arms, as long as we're doing that from a legal standpoint. But the problem is, and I hear people ask this question, but there's so many people that are not doing it from that standpoint. And so that's the reason why they feel like they have to be on guard, and they don't know what their response should be to what's happening in our society. One of the things I will say that is helpful is we need to have the dialogue and talk about these things. We need to talk about our feelings in regards to these things. It's not healthy for us to continue to act like it's not a big deal, because the reality is this is a big deal. We've seen too many incidents of mass shootings where there have been underlyings where the person that committed the act had some type of mental illness history. From what we hear with this current one, that was not the case, but it doesn't matter. It still is something that impacts us as a community, as a country as a whole, and we need to be able to talk about this and talk about our feelings around it. Because the reality is, to try to ignore it, to try to keep moving on with your day-to-day life as if it did not happen, is also not a healthy way to deal with it. So we do need to address the fact that as a country, this impacts us. And it impacts us in a lot of different ways. It can cause some very spirited debates that can cause some really, really deep feelings to come out on all sides of this issue. Some people are wholeheartedly for, we need to get rid of guns, there needs to be gun control, we should not have such easy access to weapons. And some people are on that side of the argument. There are others who are very much about their ability and their right to bear arms. So a lot of these things impact us, and to not deal with our feelings as a whole around these emotions is not effective. We do need to talk about it and deal with it. The other question that I get a lot, and I got this question on Monday, is just what do we do about people deciding that they want to go out and commit these acts of violence? And the answer I had was, I really cannot give you a definitive answer on what to do. How do we show people another way other than using a gun or using a weapon to deal with whatever issues they're processing, to deal with whatever urges they have? It's hard to say, but the reality is we have to look at the things that we ingest as a country. We are very much a country that believes in our freedom, so we very much champion for the fact that being able to bear arms is part of the amendments that a lot of people hold just as dear as freedom of speech or freedom of the press. And so a lot of people value that, and they value their freedoms to be able to do that. But we have to look at it in the context of, it's one of those rights that we have that impacts other people or can impact other people in some kind of way. And so we think it's isolated, and it's something that is just insulated to us and how we feel about our right to bear arms, but it does impact our country. And we also have to look at the images that we are watching constantly on the news. We're constantly watching images of violence happening in cities across the country. We're constantly seeing another story about unarmed people being shot and killed. We're constantly hearing rhetoric that seems like it's innocuous when we're talking about violence against certain groups of people, and we don't realize how that sets us up emotionally and mentally when it comes to this particular topic. I'll give you an example. When we hear people championing for violence against a particular group of people because we consider them to be a hate group or we consider them to be a terrorist, that is not helping the issue at large. Even though it seems like, well, they're bad people, so why should they not have bad things happen to them? That's a mentality that's a slippery slope, and we have to be very careful with that, because in a way it chips away at the morale and the morals that we carry as a human being. As a human being, just as in our nature, harming another person is not something that we should want to take pleasure in. Even if that person is trying to do harm to us, a lot of times it puts us in a place of desperation to where we act out because it's the last resort. But most people don't want to harm other people. But when we start to digest and we start to process a mentality where it's okay to hurt certain people because of this, then that's a mentality that now starts to spread, and it now becomes that slippery slope. It now becomes something to where we can say, okay, well, it's okay for us to be violent against this group of people, but not against that group of people. And how do we know people are going to be able to separate the two? if they're put in a situation like the person was put in a situation in Las Vegas. We don't. And so I think that's the reason why we have to just really be careful in what we process and not allow ourselves to get desensitized to these images. We should never, as just a human being, ever get to the place where we see violence has been committed against people, regardless of the people, regardless of their color, regardless of their race, regardless of their religion, regardless of their sexual orientation. We should never get to the place where we heard violence was committed against that group and try to find a way to justify that they were deserving of that happening. That mentality, unfortunately, is starting to eke into our society, and it's starting to be okay with certain groups of people. That's a mentality we have to fight against because it's not healthy. It's not healthy to be okay with harm coming to another person or their life ending in a tragic way, regardless of if we have issues with that person's perspectives, if we have issues with that person's lifestyle, if we even have issues with that person's ethnicity. We should never be okay with harm coming to that person, and we should never dismiss when harm comes to a group of people because they're not a group of people that we are okay with. And I think that would kind of be my answer to, in a roundabout way, to the question of what do we do to start to fight against it. The basic way to say that is remember your humanity. Remember that we're all human beings, and remember that life is precious and that all life is precious, and we do not have the right to determine whose life is more valuable than another life. For me, this is just something that I see it constantly. I'm a person that is tuned into the news, but don't try to over digest it. I do try to stay informed about what's happening, and I like to inform other people, but I don't want to constantly see the images. So I find other ways to get the news, whether it be news alerts through apps where I'm reading the story as opposed to watching it on the news where I'm seeing images. I try to find ways to be informed, but I try to not desensitize myself and lose my humanity when it comes to that. That is something that I do for me. It may not be that serious for you. You have to know what you can handle and what you cannot handle, but you also have to make sure that you continue to be a human being and you continue to value life, because that is really important. This is such a serious topic, and it's really, really hard to talk about this topic in such a short amount of time and really get to the meat of the issue. But I didn't want this week to go by and this happen and not talk about it, because it's happening too often. We're hearing too many stories, even if it wasn't on this scale. We're hearing too many stories in cities like Chicago, cities like Los Angeles, New York, and all of these major cities where we're hearing about gun violence and what is happening. And a lot of times we try to make justifications for what's happening. If this group of people weren't doing it to themselves, then this would not be an issue, when the reality is the issue is not the people. The issue is the mentality of our country when it comes to this. And that is what we have to change. We have to go to the root source of this and how we're viewing our right to bear arms, and even how we're viewing how that impacts other people in our communities and in our society. So that was the reason why I wanted to talk about it, because I feel like it's important. I feel like it's something that needs to be a dialogue between parents and children, and it needs to be a dialogue amongst spouses, amongst siblings, amongst friends, amongst colleagues. We need to have this conversation, and we need to have this conversation now. And hopefully just some of the points that I brought up in this video will make you want to talk about this and continue the dialogue. But we need to have the dialogue, because even if you don't feel like it's impacting you, it is impacting you in some kind of way. And it can wear on your emotional health and your mental health. And you want to make sure you do everything to keep yourself whole as much as possible. So again, you can find me on social media, on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. And my handle is at Dr. Malaika Speaks. My website address is malaikambrown.com. You can always go there and send me an email. Get in contact with me from that website as well. You can always send me an email directly at Malaika at malaikambrown.com is the website. Malaika at malaikambrown.com is the email address. And I look forward to hearing your comments about this particular topic. And I wish you and your family and everyone health and wellness. And I also urge everyone to just love one another, and let's get back to our basic humanity. Until next week, God bless you.